southern tip of the Malay Peninsula is the island republic of Singapore.
On the 9th of August 1965, Singapore, against the will of its people, made history. On this day, over 55 years ago, Singapore was made independent without the consent of its population, the first and only country in history to do so. What followed wasn't a celebration, it was mourning. After years of campaigning for a united Malaysian Federation, the new Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew now faced the unprecedented task of having to build an independent nation. And he succeeded. Despite being unprepared, the Singaporean leadership managed to create the wealthiest country in Southeast Asia, and one of the wealthiest in the world. A country renowned as an international centre for business and finance, with a booming tourism industry. A country with a population that enjoys prosperity, and one which shows almost no dissatisfaction with its government. However, that very government keeps them in check through a unique brand of authoritarianism, which has been built through its centuries of history and culture, of pragmatism. This is the story of how Singapore came to be. Singapore is a rock. Besides jungle, nothing naturally exists there, at least not anything of value. Yet despite this, Singapore has always been rich. Geographically, Singapore has been blessed. Located in the Malacca Strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, Singapore has always been an important transit point for international and global trade. Because of this, Singapore was an island desired by European powers. Its modern history begins when one of those powers, Great Britain, leased the island in perpetuity from the Sultan of Johor and established a trading post under the British East India Company. In the 1800s, the East India Company's policy shifted. As the sole rulers of the entire Indian subcontinent in the 1700s, the company ruled with an iron fist, utilizing slave labor and perpetuating famine and exploitation. As well as being unjust and despicable, this brutal policy also simply didn't work. And so, at the turn of the century, policy changed to focus on local development, increasing education and reducing poverty, achieved through a policy of no tax and completely unrestricted trade. This attracted the attention of traders from all over the world, especially traders from Malaysia, India, the Middle East, and, most importantly, from China. Under this colonial administration, Singapore's foundations for economic prosperity were established. A multicultural society which held the principles of wealth, trade, and economic prosperity close to heart. Over time, the blend of merchants in Singapore would create their very own culture of pragmatism and wealth. However, as Singapore expanded, the company's administration failed to do so, leading to social problems like organized crime, disease epidemics, and lawlessness to become widespread. Thus, facing collapse, the colony was ceded to the British Crown in 1867, who expanded the island's administration and reduced social problems immensely. By this time, Singapore's multicultural society had long been established. Merchants from India, Malaysia, the Middle East, and China mingled in local markets, fusing culture and communicating with one another in English. However, one ethnic group dominated most of all, the Chinese, influencing Singaporean society more so than the Indian, Arab, and Malay communities could ever hope to. But those who settled the island never longed for their homeland. To them, Singapore was their new forever home, something which their future overlords overlooked.
These are among the last pictures taken before the fall of Singapore. We released them because they are a part of British Empire history, for good or ill. But it's hard to look at them without bitterness and unrest.
In 1942, World War II broke into Singapore with Japan's conquest. The effect of the 3-year Japanese occupation of Singapore, as brief as it was, had a profound effect on what the nation would become. The Japanese military ruled with exceptional brutality. Although those who lived in Singapore held little loyalty to their original homelands, the Japanese nevertheless saw them as traitors and collaborators. In particular, the Singaporean Chinese were systematically abused, out of vengeance for resistance in China proper. Tens of thousands of Chinese, Tamils, and Malay were executed en masse. and enslaved by the Japanese military during a 3-year reign of terror. By the time the Japanese surrendered and the British re-established control of the island, the damage had already been done. In the eyes of Singaporeans, a once loyal, pro-British colony, Britain had lost their legitimacy. Now they were simply an archaic colonial power that ran at the first sign of danger and had abandoned them to the wolves. Anti-colonialism thus firmly took hold after the war. In 1959, Singapore gained internal self-governance and, in 1963, full independence in a federation with Malaysia. Union with Malaysia was seen as the only way forward for Singapore, and favoured by the vast majority of its population. The newly elected government of Singapore, the People's Action Party under its first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, pursued this union ferociously. Singapore's prosperity and well-being, in the view of those at the time, hinged on them remaining a part of Malaysia. But Malaysia had other views. A nationalist federal government with a view of ethnic supremacy came to power, one which saw ethnic Malays as superior to Singapore's majority Chinese population. The years of federation under Malaysia thus saw extreme racial tension and violence resulting in the deaths of ethnic Chinese and Malays alike. Both the PAP and federal Malay government accused the other of inciting racial hatred and discrimination, despite the onus lying almost entirely with the federal government, who routinely discriminated against Singapore's ethnic Chinese. Despite the hardship, Singapore's PAP worked tirelessly to heal the division and cement their place within the Malay Federation. But, after 2 years of unbearable racial violence, Malay-Singaporean relations were damaged beyond repair. On August 9, 1965, the Malay federal government voted unanimously to expel Singapore from the Federation. A distraught and depressed Lee Kuan Yew was then forced to read his country's Declaration of Independence on TV. Singapore became the first country in history to achieve independence against its own will.
You see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, as a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship, would you mind if we stop for a while?
Despite becoming independent reluctantly, Singapore's leadership saw no going back. Empty promises from Malaysia's government had been made, stating that the federation may be possible in the future, though these were not taken seriously. Singapore's newly independent leader, Lee Kuan Yew, thus inherited an unstable situation, a barren island city-state with no natural wealth. High unemployment, low education, and high levels of homelessness would fail without proper leadership, and Lee acted accordingly. Singapore's economy was stimulated with attention to manufacturing, causing industry to boom. The location in the Malacca Strait was thoroughly exploited. Ships passing through were encouraged to use Singapore as a stop-off point. Visiting sailors then boosted demand for services and helped lower unemployment. Homelessness and squatting was rampant. Most people lived in hastily built shacks throughout the entire city, leading to Singapore developing one of the most successful social housing schemes in the world, almost entirely eliminating homelessness. A large part of Singapore's economic success, however, is down to simply the time they lived in. The mid-1900s saw the rise of globalization and the spread of international trade. Those countries which are most successful today took full advantage of this transition, especially those in Asia. South Korea used protectionism to protect domestic corporations from foreign competition, whilst also exporting their goods all over the world, resulting in their becoming an economic titan. Similar stories occurred in Japan, Taiwan and Hong Kong, and Singapore was no different. The PAP took advantage of the increase in global trade to attract foreign investment and completely transform it from a struggling rock into one of the biggest economic forces in the world. But the methods by which this success was achieved were morally dubious, to say the least.
When people say, "Oh, ask the people," it's childish rubbish. They say people can think for themselves. Do you honestly believe that the chap who can't pass primary 6 knows the consequences of his choice when he answers a question viscerally on language, culture, and religion? We would starve. We would have race riots. We would disintegrate.
The People's Action Party is a husk. Its ideology has shifted over the decades based on a pragmatic approach of what works and what is popular. Morals do not and have not entered their frame of thought. Originally, the PAP was established as a leftist organization. Lee Kuan Yew and his followers believed in socialism, opposing the West and colonialism. Lee himself, at one point, even openly and explicitly endorsed communism. But whether he truly believed this or not is doubtful. Its effect, however, was the winning over of a Chinese population who was wholly sympathetic to communism. As time progressed, the PAP shifted further and further away from the left, as the population became increasingly more convinced by capitalist success. In the early days of independence, Lee viewed Singapore as fragile. One wrong move and the country could be ripped apart. So, through that famous brand of Singaporean pragmatism, the PAP pursued a corporatist authoritarianism. Foreign investment, the lifeblood of Singapore, didn't come from the Soviets or the Chinese. It came from those Americans they regarded as filthy imperialists just a few years previously, and so maintaining good relations with them has always been paramount. Disillusioned with this alliance, a group of PAP leftists splintered and formed the Barisan Socialist Party, a far-left anti-American group. But before they could take hold, Lee's government cracked down on them, arresting 113 left-wing politicians in one single night. With one swift action, the Singaporean left was almost completely destroyed. In the early days of independence, the PAP eradicated parliamentary opposition, cracked down on public political activity, and gained complete control of academia. But their biggest challenge lay in the media. As a former British territory, Singapore had a legacy of free press. Hundreds of outlets printed freely the grievances of the public, the last forum on which such criticism could be freely discussed. Throughout the 1970s, the PAP launched a ruthless campaign of censorship, targeting newspaper executives and using their parliamentary monopoly to pass anti-press laws. 1971, the Singapore Herald, a decades-old newspaper agency, had its license abruptly revoked, accused by the government of being involved in black operations on behalf of foreign powers. 1973, Lee Yu-seng, director of Nanyang Xiang Bao, a newspaper in existence for 50 years, was arrested on the accusation of stirring up Chinese racial emotions. Soon after, the Eastern Sun closes down, stating that its executives live in fear of being targeted. 1974, the PAP put the final nail in the coffin, passing the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act. All newspapers were now to be publicly traded. Shares in these companies could only be held by Singaporean citizens, and management shares, which gave holders 200 times the voting power, plus the ability to hire and dismiss journalists, could only be bought through government approval. This act effectively put all media in government control, and is still enforced today.
We want the mass media to reinforce, not undermine, the cultural values and the social attitudes being inculcated in our schools and universities. Freedom of the press, freedom of the news media must be subordinate to the overriding needs of Singapore.
By the 1980s, all public dissent had been either eradicated or co-opted by Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP. Singapore's authoritarianism may sound frightening to us in the West, but to a majority of Singaporeans it's seen as necessary. The development of Singapore's culture in the 1800s, which puts economic welfare above all else, combined with the tumultuous period of independence, created a society which is pragmatic more than anything. Rather than being ruled by parties with ideologies, Singapore is ruled by a party which can best be described as ideologically neutral. Everything is in the pursuit of economic well-being and social harmony, something the PAP has arguably achieved. The PAP enjoys a monopoly on power, control of the media, financial barriers to run for election, and manipulation of the electoral system has guaranteed their overwhelming victory every time. The PAP controls the judiciary and trade unions. Freedom of assembly is effectively outlawed, since protesters need to register government approval beforehand, and academia is heavily censored. Corporal and capital punishment are enforced. Certain offences will get you sentenced to canings, like some medieval justice. And drug offences, including simple possession over a certain amount, can get you a mandatory death sentence. Drug trafficking is thus the #1 crime that receives the death penalty in Singapore.
Enemies.
They have criticized the human rights record. The number of executions, for instance, haven't they?
They may believe that if you're kind to drug traffickers, you get a better society. In Singapore, before you land, their hostess or the steward will announce that there are very heavy penalties if you're found with more than a stated number of grams of certain prohibited drugs. And if you still come in with a few kilos of them, which will destroy hundreds, thousands of families, one death is too kind.
Just this year, there have been 3 executions related to drug offences, including the highly publicised execution of Malaysian national Nagainthan Dharmalingam, a 33-year-old man with learning difficulties and an IQ of 69, who was hanged on April 27, 2022, for possessing just under 43 grams of heroin. But the Singaporean people seem to support this. Anonymous polls in 2020 say that 57% approve of the government, including an unheard 30% of the opposition. Singaporeans seem content with political neutrality and the mild opposition, which is tolerated. Freedom of religion is heavily protected, and Singapore is considered one of the least corrupt countries on earth. And this, again, comes down to Singapore's famous pragmatism. Why would they want democracy if authoritarianism gives them jobs, education, homes, and security? In the future, it could all change. Many nations were mostly autocratic during their development, and only adopted democracy when prosperity had been achieved. Perhaps the same could be true of Singapore, or the modern internet age could give the PAP greater control of the country and solidify their rule even further. Whatever the case, one thing is certain. Whatever Singapore chooses to do, it will be based on pragmatism, not morals. Thank you to Arken the American for helping voice those 2 quotes from Lee Kuan Yew. If you haven't already, a link to his channel is in the description where you can go and subscribe. He makes great political content and I highly recommend. Also, a special thank you to Joshua Roll, my first Tier 4 patron. You are an incredible human, and I will be buying you a lot of alcohol soon, once I'm not sick. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video, hopefully very soon.